Welcome to the Saugatuck-Douglas Historical Society walking tour. When the Historical Society, I'm using the old name, first started, Jim Schmeeken was a resident of Saugatuck, and he was very interested in the architecture of the buildings. And he got a PhD out of it, frankly. But he did a lot of looking at the buildings, and he put together a walking tour, which I have the pamphlet for. Short cord, I'm caught. And those of us who volunteered to do this used to meet people down at the interurban park, Jones Park, and it was $5 per person. And we would walk around downtown and talk about the buildings that were downtown. And then this pamphlet was also developed, which has a lot of information about many buildings on the hill, homes. There's 3 different walking tours in here if you're interested in architecture, but I don't know if they publish this anymore. I looked for it a couple times.
I was gonna say, can you get a copy of this?
I don't know. We have to talk to the to the History Center. We have to talk to them now because it's a new.
Has a new name.
New name, yeah. But anyway, so I'm basing some of this on stories that my family told me, and most of this on what I learned from Jim Schmeeken's studies about all the buildings in Saugatuck. So if somebody would please close the blinds so we can see. Thank you.
Can I see that, Cathy, or can you use it?
Sure. Just don't lose it. It's the only one I have.
Yes, you already got it. Okay.
Oh, no, it says no signal. Laura.
Let's turn the lights down. See what happens if you just,
It was all ready to go.
I think it may have just gone to sleep.
Yeah.
It wasn't used for so long.
Oh, while she's adjusting the tech, on the front of the stage there are 7 publications that are of interest because of history in Saugatuck. Most of them are Kit Lane's work. Others are by other people who were interested in history in Saugatuck. One of them is a village cookbook, and I have it open to the page where I put my grandmother's chicken fat cookie recipe with a picture of my grandma. And then there are two big books that Kit Lane did. I did not bring a copy of May Heath's book. I do have one, but that's not my go-to source for Saugatuck history because
May I ask, are the cookies good? With the chicken?
they are very good.
Okay.
They're very rich. My grandma grew up, she was at 1900 or 18, whatever. Anyway, she cooked on a wood stove during the Depression, and there wasn't any butter, except if you had a cow, and they didn't have a cow. They had chickens. So she would take the fat from the chickens and reduce it down and save it like you do bacon fat. And when she had a cup, she would use that to make her oatmeal cookies. And they are so much richer than regular oatmeal cookies. And we grew up on chicken fat oatmeal cookies. Man, that was a real treat. Okay, here we are on Butler Street. William Butler is the first settler of Allegan County. So that is our main street. And we are going to be walking down both sides of the street. So you're probably going to get dizzy going back and forth across the street while we do this. But anyway, here we go. Welcome to a walking tour. Our first stop is the Saugatuck Village Hall. This is at 102 Butler Street, and it was the fire station from 1880 to 1954. It was remodeled in 1924 to put this, sorry, I don't have a pointer, to put that fancy front on it. You'll notice a lot of the buildings are going to have Colonial Revival with pillars and stuff. In the early 20s, Saugatuck went through a real revival boom of colonial stuff. So there's a lot of buildings with big pillars on them that was the architectural craze at the time.
Was it remodeled as a fire station or as a city hall?
It was always a fire station, and it was remodeled to be the city hall. Good question.
In the 1920s? 1940s?
That I don't know.
Okay.
I'll let you research that. Actually, there is some really good stuff if you get into the website for the History Center. There's some real good information about stuff. I have to save this for later. I'm going to give you too much information, I know, because I have a ton of it. It's currently the city government chamber. The original style was Italianate, and you'll hear that several times. And in 1924, then Carl Herman did the remodeling with the Colonial Revival, and you'll hear that several times. Then across the street was this building, which now is for the love of shoes and Kilwins, I believe. It was the first department store in town. And upstairs it had a huge hall with a stage at one point, and that was still there in the 1960s because my grandma worked, that's Irene Webster, she worked for, what's his name, Green, and they did sewing up on the second floor. Green, not Green and Howard, maybe it was Green and Howard. Anyway, so we would go up there and visit Grandma while she was busy making chenille with her sewing machine up in and the stage was still there. It was very cool. So then the Butler Pantry people bought it and they made it back into a department store and remodeled the whole thing. That was late after the 60s. Across the street again was a building that, my cards are out of order. This is a building that came from Singapore. You will recall that Singapore was down at the mouth of the river, and it was a very active lumbering town. And when the sand dunes started to blow and the lumber was all gone, and the lumber mills had gone up to Mackinac, the village of Singapore decided to move. So they would take the buildings that they could, they would put them on logs, and they would pull them along, moving the logs in front, from back to front, back to front, after the river froze, and they would pull them down the river to this area, which was called the Flats, and then they could bring the buildings up on shore and put them wherever they wanted to. And they brought businesses and they brought houses. So there are quite a few buildings that originated in Singapore. If you go in this building, I don't know if they've covered up the floor, but when it was the antique store, all of the original old wood was on the floor, and it looked pretty shabby inside because it was an old building. But they've dressed it up to be a clothing store now, so who knows. This was called the Landmark Building. Now it is, of course, Kilwin's. It was built in 1878, and this is the Italianate style of architecture with the arched windows and the brackets under the eaves. And there used to be a fancy iron balcony across the whole front side. It was known as the men's building. You can see why this women's club. This was the men's building. And on the second floor, there was a large meeting hall for the men's clubs. There were quite a few men's clubs in town. You can see that in one of the thicker history books. Lodges and just every kind of men's club you could think of, they had lots of them. The first floor was a general store, and the owner stocked furs, and he brought in a watchdog to guard the furs. Well, the dog ate the furs. Too bad. Susan B. Anthony did come to Saugatuck, and she stayed at the Park House, which is by the Southerner, and she spoke in this building about
Men's club?
Yeah.
Ed and the Men's Club, yes.
I think it was the Odd Fellows, they call it, the Odd Fellows.
Well, that was one of them. There were quite a few clubs. She was here in March of 1879, and she was talking about voting, women's voting, and she started the local Christian Temperance Union, and she was successful in closing 6 of the village's 14 saloons. So Susan B. Anthony made a mark on our tiny village. We moved on down the street to this building, which we know as Pumpernickel's right now, and this was the Union Hotel. It was built in 1864, before the Landmark building. And the north side shows a Greek Revival style, and that's the side that we see here. If you go upstairs, the window panes are original glass in that building. So it's real interesting. And you can imagine that was the hotel upstairs. I was shocked the first time I went up there. Those rooms had to be so tiny because there's not much room upstairs in that building. But this place had a temperance saloon, so it didn't get closed. The difference was that it only sold beer, not whiskey. This building was first a hotel, then it was a billiard parlor, and it was a grocery store when I was young. And it was a meat market after that, and finally a restaurant of various and assorted names, including now Pumpernickel's. I started taking these pictures last fall when I thought I was going to do this program in the spring. So some of these are fall, and some of them are spring. Oh, this slide showed up. This was a meat market, Waltz's Meat Market, and then for 20 years it was the Log Cabin Tavern. And now, of course, it's several shops. And I moved the card because one time I went through this and I didn't see this slide, so I put the card someplace else. So we'll just keep going. This building is one of 2 Heath buildings in town. The rectangular up on the top has the name Heath on it. The Heaths were very big cheeses in the community, and so they could afford to build buildings. This is Italianate Commercial. This building was built in 1920s, and it was built as a post office. You know that that desk back there was an old post office. Please read the sign on that. That was the beginning post office. So we didn't have a building until the 20s. The post office moved around to various and assorted businesses, and it also was in a building that was at 526 Butler Street where my family lived, my ancestors, the Wheelers. And that building doesn't exist anymore, but so this was our new post office in 1920, which was a real post office. James Brandis uses it for his studio, and when you go in the front door, you can see the original mailboxes and the delivery window. One of them is still there. And I think the original wooden floor is still in the building. It hasn't been covered up. So it's fun to just go in and look around a little bit. My old mailbox is still there. P.O. Box 328.
Oh.
And it's E1M4 if you'd like to try and open the door. Okay, you'll recognize this building because, this is one of the later additions to downtown, the Ostings building. And the Ostings building was built as a laundromat, and one of the tables has a Ostings building placard on it, so you can see the beginning of the building and what it looks like now. But I really like the Ostings family, so I thought I should include them in this program because they were part of my settlement of Saugatuck. This is the other Heath building. And this was the first one they built. This was built in 1907. This is Italianate commercial, and it was built from locally made bricks. It was, and one of your tables has this building on it, and you can see a picture with Bird's Drugstore. As also, there was a saloon and a soda shop and retail shops, and one of the shops was the district library in the 1960s. The second floor was a hotel. And also the front rooms were the local telephone operator's office early in the 1920s. And my grandma and my auntie were operators along with Jessie Dietz and several other single ladies. And they had crank phones and a switchboard and with the plugs and all that stuff. And they had 24-hour service, so somebody had to stay there overnight. So they had a very exciting life, the girls at the phone company. When the people would come to town to go to the pavilion, of course, nobody could leave the phone company, so Grandma said they used to have taffy parties, and they would invite the guys to come over to have a taffy pull, so they could have a social event and not leave their phones. The interesting part about this building to me is that the Bruckman families bought Bruckman Corner at the Flats. This is the Flats. And they lived here in the house in front from 1860 until 1930. So that part of the building is 1860. Also in 1860, they owned all the way from this corner up to the top of the hill. They gave the hilltop to a small group of people who wanted to start the Congregational Church. So that's why the church is up on the hill in their backyard. And I'll talk about the Congregational Church a little bit. But in the 1930s, when Minnie Bruckman, as you know, was still living in the house, she was good friends with May Heath, and she was part of the Women's Club. So she gave her house and the property behind the house to May Heath and the Little Women's Club and challenged them to build a building for a women's club because of all the other men's clubs all over the place. Challenged them to raise money and build this building. And they did. They worked hard and they built it. So this building was built in 1936. And the money was earned by the members of the Women's Club. And we're still going over 100 years later. The building auditorium architect was Thomas Eddy Talmage from Chicago. And he was second only to Frank Lloyd Wright in architecture at the time. And this building is a colonial style, Colonial Revival a little bit, because Thomas Eddy Talmage did a lot of work to help revive Colonial Williamsburg. So we're related to Colonial Williamsburg in that sense. And he also did a colonial village in 1933 for the Chicago World's Fair. So we were part of his Colonial Revival. And here, up the hill, is the Congregational Church, the First Congregational Church. This Saugatuck was first settled in 1829, and it was incorporated in 1868. But there were no churches until 1860, and there were about 1,000 people in Newark Township, which was the name of this township before it was named Saugatuck by a postmaster. On January 11th of 1860, there was a meeting at the Pine Grove School, and I'll show you a picture of the Pine Grove School in just a second, where they organized the Congregational Church. And that summer, they built a one-room brown wooden building on this present site up the hill. In the 1890s, the art glass windows were added, and there was a lounge annexed and a separate entrance. In 1910, a basement and the Good Shepherd window, if you go inside the church, was added. It's in a different place. It was in the north, up in the chapel chancel, and it got moved when we did the addition in the 1980s, 87, 88. In 1940, the entrance and the belfry were redesigned, as well as the brick was put on it, because on Veterans Day there was a huge storm and it blew over the belfry and they had a lot of damage that they had to fix. So Carl Herman, being the generous man that he was and a member of the church, redesigned the outer facade and the bell tower for the Congregational Church and the brick front and all that stuff, because they had to replace the stucco. And in 1861, a year after the church was founded, that was the meeting place for all of the men in town before they went off to the Civil War. And there's a historical marker in front of the church about that. This is the front entrance that Carl Herman designed. And there was a sign in the yard, and we wanted to get a new sign a few years ago. So we had to go to the Historic Commission to get the new sign. We could not, we had to save the old sign because Carl Herman designed it. So we had to put the old sign up close to the building and the new sign out in the front. So when you're dealing with the Historic Commission, what they say goes. And so when we deal with, like when we did the basement stairs, I had to go to the Historic Commission because we had to make sure that everything on the outside looked just like it was never changed. This is the Pine Grove School building, which is a little bitty cottage down at the end of the block. This is the Pine Grove School building, and it was where the people met. It was a school and a meeting house, and then it became private residence. And Frederick Fersman, who was the director of Oxbow, was living here, and he had the facade remodeled to the Colonial Revival, which you see the pillars and the round window up in the top and the windows, by Thomas Eddy Talmage. And it's still there today. We're going to take us, we're going to go up the hill on Mary Street, from Mary Street to Griffith Street, which is the block where the Congregational Church is, because up on this block there are fantastic examples of homes that were built at various times for the ship's captains and other wealthy people who didn't want to live downtown here with the riffraff and be with the taverns and all that kind of stuff. This one was stucco on the outside, and this was, it was clapboard before it was stucco. But inside this house is beautiful oak, I think, woodwork and floors. It's just gorgeous on the inside. And this was William Clark's house. He was a captain and a shipbuilder, and it was built in 1880. Then we have the Leland House, which is across the street. And that was built, I don't have a date for that, but that was another ship captain's house. And we have the Hungerford Clark House, which was built in 1888. And you notice that most of these have big front porches because people would go and sit out on the porch, whereas some of them don't have porches at all because they didn't have the luxury time to sit on their porches. But this is the Waugh home now. It's still owned by the Waugh family. Oh no, this is Hungerford, sorry. The next one is the Waugh house. This one. This is the Winslow house, and this was built in 1868. Notice a small front porch. Pond, Winslow, Waugh family, and it is still part of the Waugh family. And then we take a little jog around the corner up Hoffman Street. This is where the Edgecombe family lived for quite a few years. This is a Dutch colonial. It's the Verona model from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And it was built in 1926. And it costs $4,347 to buy it. A doctor lived in this house, and the far right-hand windows, there was an entrance on that side of the house, which the Edgecombs remodeled to make a dining room. And then it has been sold since then, and I'm not sure what they did to the dining room, but there was a doctor's office, and then the rest of the house was the house. And this is one of 2 Sears Roebuck houses that we have in town. This is not a Sears Roebuck house. This was a ship's captain's house. This was Moore, M-O-O-R-E, and he was a lumberman, and it was big enough for his family and his servants.
Oh.
Yeah, it was huge private residence. The living room of this house, we had it as a parsonage for our church, for the Congregational Church. The living room is from this front window on the left side all the way to the back of the house. Runs the whole length of the house. It's just huge. And then there's many bedrooms upstairs. Okay, back down to Butler Street now. This is the end of Butler Street, right next to the village square. And this is Dr. Walker's building. It was built in 1908. Again, Italianate commercial. And the front half was various retail establishments. In the rear of the building was Dr. Walker's practice. He was the medical doctor in Saugatuck from 1845 to 1943. And in the large history books, there is a list of all the other doctors that were here from the time that Butler was here until Dr. Walker. Yeah. Behind this building, there's a little alley that runs next to it, which does have a street name, is this little house, which was white a long time ago. And this was the first hospital.
Oh, wow.
A building dedicated to be a hospital, and my mother was born in this hospital.
Wow.
Okay, then now we're in the park. And we are very fortunate to have our own cannon. It came to the park in the 1840s, before the Civil War. We are fortunate to still have it because during all those years when we had several conflicts in the United States and there were scrap drives for metal, one or two or several of the city fathers quietly put the cannon away to be saved. So we still have it today, and it does operate. And my brothers are so talented, they can fire that cannon. Usually they do it for Veterans Day, but they did not do it this year. They had a smaller, more modern cannon, and I haven't discussed with them why they didn't do the old one, but they are thrilled to shoot it off. On the back of the village square is the Christian Science building. And that is, in front of it is a street name. That's Main Street, only it's just barely wide enough for a horse and buggy. It was built in 1925 in the Colonial Revival style. Notice with the big white pillars and everything. On to the other side of the park is now known as the Maplewood Hotel, and it's been that way for a long time, but it was known as originally a general store. There was a building built there as a general store. And then there was a furniture store. It was built the first building was built in 1860. It's probably no longer there. And the furniture store. And then in 1870s, they added living quarters for the furniture store. And it was transformed into a summer resort and a boarding house. And then in 1923, Frank and Carrie Wicks, who built Wickwood, which is still Wickwood, bought this building and remodeled it to make it into the Grand Hotel with the Italianate Revival done in 1923. One notable visitor was the artist Albert Crable. He was an instructor at Oxbow, and he came back in the wintertime to do landscapes of the Lake Michigan area. And if you watch Antiques Roadshow, you may have heard his name, because once in a while his paintings show up. Okay, then across the street from the Maplewood also was this part of the Maplewood was a bus station, and it was the Saugatuck Police Department at one time, when the McRae's owned it and ran it as a hotel, and Bobby McRae was the police dispatcher. So it's had a colorful existence. The Greyhound bus used to stop here, and then they quit coming into town. A lot of people would get off to come in the 50s, come to Saugatuck on the Greyhound bus. And then they stopped, passengers, so then they were at Terra, out on the Blue Star Highway. That was the bus stop, because they didn't want to come into town. And then that was kind of the bus business around here. Okay, we are at Wilkins Hardware, which at the time that I initially did this was the oldest continuous business in Saugatuck. It was founded in 1868 in a wooden building that was built next door where there's a house now, and I'll show you that house. And it burned in 1903. So the Konings, or the nieces, I can't remember which, but anyway, they built the brick building on the present space, and that was constructed in 1904. It also is Italianate commercial. And inside our original floors, there is a tin ceiling that's beautiful, but it might have been covered up recently because of fire code stuff. And there's a freight elevator that still is used to take things down to the basement, not people though. And until the 1970s, it had the original counter, sales counter, and on the end of it were links of rope, because the rope was down in the basement and there were holes in the floor. So if you wanted to buy rope, they'd measure it and cut it for you, but the rope was down. And there were nail bins in the front of the sales counter. And it was a really cool place to go when you were a kid, because it was really full of hardware. And the man, Heath Crow, who worked there, was a really interesting guy. He was a sailor in the South Pacific during World War II, and he was kind of like a coast watcher. So it was a really interesting man to talk to. Okay, so we have Koning Hardware, now called Old Hardware Building. And this is the front. You can see the Italianate. Upstairs was where the Wilkins were living. It's been converted into smaller apartment areas. You can see the house next door on the left, which we are going to look at. That is the second Sears Roebuck house in town. And this used to be called the Victorian Inn, and now it's the Inn of Saugatuck. It was installed in 1904, and this is where the original hardware stood that burned. This Sears catalog house was called the Queen Anne, and it was the second largest model in the catalog. And the Konings lived there for many, many years before it became the Victorian Inn. And then across the street, this is the Koning Wiley house. This was built in 1922, and this was the son of the hardware store owner. So you can see the changes between 18 whatever and 1920 in architecture. And this one has the Colonial Revival front. And then this one has an addition on the back, because when the Wileys moved in, they had kids, so they needed more room. And if you take a careful look at that, that was when we had the Historic Commission started. And you can see that that addition is very complementary to the front of the house. It doesn't take anything away from the original building. So that is the value of our Historic Commission. And people grieve when they have to deal with the Historic Commission, but it preserves a lot of beautiful architecture. This is coming back towards the Women's Club. This is the Timothy Coates' house. And this was built in 1852. It was built without the front porch. The porch was added later, but it was built for one of Saugatuck's lighthouse keepers, Timothy Coates. And there's a plate on the fence in front of this house. It's an excellent example of Greek revival. The porch was added later. And this is where the Maycrofts lived. So when I lived across the street, we would go over and visit Grandma Maycroft. This is the Judson Heath home, which now has the name on it of the original owner, Judson Heath. This was built in 1858, so this is a very early construction for Saugatuck, before the city was even named Saugatuck. It was the largest house in the village, and it was a home for the Heaths and their family, plus it was a boarding house for the lumbermen who worked in the mills all along the river and down in Singapore. The construction style is post and frame, but it has a larger commercial kitchen on the back that bumps out. And while I was working at the hardware store, I had the fortune to talk to an older man who lived in Saugatuck a long time ago, and he told me a story about the lady who was the cook in this house, and she and her son lived in the house. Son was about 10 years old, and this is the front porch that was originally the style of this building porch. And the lumber guys, when they were relaxing after working a hard day, would sit out on the front porch and enjoy their liquid refreshments. Well, one of the guys talked the 10-year-old boy into taking the pail down and getting them a pail of beer and bringing it back. And he said, if you do this, I'll give you a dime, which was a lot of money. So this kid, I'm gonna go get a dime. So he did that, and he got his dime. And then when he came back, he went in and told his mom he was so proud of his dime, and she took it away from him and said, you can't do that. They shouldn't have that. Across the street, catty corner, is a house that was built by Miss Jean Goldsmith. And she was a retired art teacher from Detroit. And this house she designed herself in an international style, modeled after Bauhaus and other 1930s style architecture. It was covered with ivy. It still is. It's beautiful. The thing on the back, there's a bump out on the back that's just sort of there. But you can see the Historic Commission working hard to protect the integrity of this architecture by the addition on the back, what they allowed for them to put in the back. Next to this house, where it's not anymore, is 526 Butler Street, and that was the site of another big white house, 2 floors, which was the home of the Wheeler family, and those are my ancestors. This house didn't have a front porch on it. It had like a bridge from the sidewalk to the house, because the house was down lower than the sidewalk. And the house at one time acted as, part of it was the post office, or that desk was in it, I don't know. Anyway, and at one point there was a carnival in town, and they had a buffalo as part of their carnival, and the buffalo got loose, and it went into that house. So that house was known as the Buffalo House. When they tore it apart in 1958, because we moved out in 1958 and moved up to my mother's modern house, which had warm floors. It was wonderful. There was no full stud or piece of lumber. It was all made out of scrap lumber from the lumber mills. Mount Baldhead was a bare sand dune. And in the spring, the Native Americans would come to the sand dune. The women and children would stay down below and do their thing, and the men would go up to the top and have their spring cleansing ceremony. But because Saugatuck's a resort area, Mount Baldhead became famous for many people to go and visit, so there are photographs of people in all stages of formal dress with long skirts and hats, ladies with hats and all that kind of stuff. And they climbed up the steps to the top of Mount Baldhead so they could look around and all that kind of stuff. So the radar tower was part of a DEW line defense system that was built in the 1960s. And they had to tow everything up beside the stairs to build that on the top of the stairs, on the top of the hill. I'm sorry, it was decommissioned in 1968. The technology was way out of date. And the village bought it from the Air Force in for $250. They bought the stuff on the top of Mount Baldhead. This is Wicks Park, and this is famous for the bandstand. In 1886, this was the Britain Shipyard property, site of one of many shipyards in Saugatuck. Over 200 large and small boats were built between 1840 and 1915. There were steamers and tugs and barges. And then the shipyards closed when the local passenger and freight transport switched to the railroad, which you all know as the electric interurban. The bandstand was a present from the gazebo, from the Saugatuck citizens to themselves for the bicentennial in 1976. And the unique public restroom with the Georges Seurat painting on it was designed by Krista Wise, and it was originally painted by high school art students. But it's been updated and kept by various and assorted other art people. This building is a little sleeper across the street. This was the F.T. Kleeman Saloon. It was built in 1860, so it was an early building, and it was notorious because the workers would go there frequently, the sailors and the loggers and everybody. Now, Mr. Kleeman was from Germany, Frankfurt, Germany, and he made wine out of local grapes. He was the first vintner in the area. But they had apparently wild days at this saloon. Now has been restored, and it is a private residence. Thank goodness. Because it was a bubble tea place and a bunch of other stuff. Across the street, we have the Linedecker Hotel, or Coral Gables in 1959. It was Hotel Saugatuck Coral Gables. The Linedecker Hotel the property was bought in 1898, and it was originally a saloon and inn, and it burned. In 1900, and burned in 1900. In 1901, a new building was planned, similar to this one today, but they only built half of it, the left side gable. Then they built the second gable and finished the construction in 1905, and so now it has balanced with two gables. It was also the Columbia Hotel, the Georgian Bay Line storage building, and it was headquarters for the North and South America, which were big ships that were on Lake Michigan, the cruise. And then in 1920, it became Hotel Saugatuck. In about the 1930s, the Crowbar was named. In 1959, it became Coral Gables, Hotel Saugatuck. Then in 1960, it was remodeled, and it was almost complete. And then the building next door burned. We all know that was the pavilion, yeah. And the heat was so strong from the fire of the pavilion that it broke all the windows out on the side where the El Forno restaurant is. But what saved the building was they had bought fireproof draperies, and they had closed them. And one of the fire departments that came for the fire sprayed the building to keep it from burning. So they replaced the windows, and they did extensive cleaning, and they had a grand opening of the El Forno, called the Oven. And then many changes have been made since then, but it is still the original 1901 building under everything, even upstairs in the... This is the site of a famous David and Goliath battle between the city of Saugatuck and the McDonald's Corporation. The people who bought this property wanted to put in a walk-up McDonald's restaurant.
Whoa.
Well, you can imagine how that went over with everybody in town, because that was just not the character of Saugatuck.
What year was that?
Gosh, I don't remember. I should
It
look.
was in the 1970s, no, it was early 80s, and Peg Sanford was the mayor.
Okay. And it was, legal back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
About this.
Several years, but the city prevailed. So this beautiful cottage is still there, and it is owned privately. I went in there one time a couple summers ago because they had it open one day in the summer. They were selling some handmade dolls that one of the family members had made. But it's a beautiful cottage.
Ida Red started there.
Oh, really?
What started there?
Ida Red started there.
Oh, yes, that's right. Ida Retz was there. And then we talked about that building that burned. This was a big pavilion. It was a big wooden dance hall built in 1909 during 2 months. And it was open in time for July 4th. It was 200 feet by 100 feet, and it was built on the riverbank and extended out over the water onto pilings. So there was a great dock across the back. The curved wooden arches were outlined with thousands of electric light bulbs. But there was no electricity in town. They had a steam generator for their building. And the interurban tracks, the interurban was an electric railroad that was all over Michigan. I was amazed. It's not just from Holland to Saugatuck, it was all over the place. From 1899 through 1927. And the interurban tracks came all the way down Water Street, which is why Water Street is so wide, and came down and had a loop by the pavilion and the Butler. They would bring in passengers who would come to the pavilion for a night of dancing, and then the train would wait, and there were also boats that came over from Chicago and docked on the riverside. And then they would wait for the last dance, and people could come out, get on the interurban, ride back to Holland or wherever they were going, and they would get on the boats and go back across the lake. Some of them would jump onto the boats as the boats were pulling away. There was quite a wild and crazy place there. In 1912, they added a movie theater onto the north end. And I remember going to a movie there. I saw Tom Thumb. So I remember seeing Tom Thumb riding on the donkey's head with his ear in it. And then this was one of the first theaters in the area to have a sound system, because they did have silent movies, and then they graduated up to talkies. And the summer features changed daily. The dance hall had free admission for a while, but they had a little money trouble, so they started charging everybody to go in the building, the pavilion. And if you wanted to dance, you had to buy tickets, 8 cents a dance. And then there were more spectators, so they charged more to get in. In the 20s and 30s, they had themed nights, like a ticklish party, and everybody who bought a ticket got a feather tickler.
Oh, God.
So when they were dancing, they could tickle each other. There was a farm and barn party. There was a snowball party, and they threw fake snowballs at each other. And there was an artist's ball coordinated with Oxbow. In 1938, they got a liquor license, and there was a full restaurant in the lower level. And there was a big organ in there because the dance floor, they couldn't do dancing so much, so they started roller skating, and there was an organ in there. Dizzy Gillespie and his quintet were here in 1959. And the annual Saugatuck Jazz Festival with Wayne King and Duke Ellington also happened there in May 6th of 1960. Unfortunately, there were 24 streams of water trying to keep the fire from burning down the city. The building burned in less than an hour. They released the kids, it was a Friday afternoon, and they released the kids from school because it wasn't safe to be in the building. And just because of the direction of the wind, which was out of the east, the town was saved. But they took high school kids across the river, and they went through the woods across the river with shovels and rakes and put out little fires because the embers were going across. And unfortunately, one cottage burned down, and that was Jane Underwood's family's cottage that burned.
Jane has told us.
Yeah, she maintains today that it was the mobs out of Chicago.
That burned, but they did get it.
Yes, they got a new house. It was pretty creepy. We were out on the playground all afternoon, and we saw all this horrendous smoke flying up and everything. My dad was working at Saugatuck Marine, so he went down behind the pavilion and took, there were yachts docked behind it, because in May they started putting the boats in the water. And he untied all these boats and took all the ropes and drove one of the boats and pulled all the other yachts away from the dock so they would not be burned by the fire, because it was such an intense fire. And as I said, it melted the windows on the El Forno, and the Hollyhock house across the street had damage as well because of the heat melting the windows and stuff. It was a huge inferno. And I mentioned earlier that Water Street, you may have noticed that Water Street is wider than the other streets. Well, Water Street was so wide because the interurban track ran down there, and it came down to a loop by the pavilion. By then it was a standard gauge railroad, and they could put on regular passenger cars and freight cars to bring things into Saugatuck, like the Sears Roebuck house kits, and fruit was taken out. There was so much fruit that somebody made a comment one time that they could see one of the boats was going out through the channel, and they could see all the fruit flies flying over the boat because it was The interurban did a brisk passenger and freight business for this steam railroad tracks in Holland, up to the steam railroad tracks in Holland. But it was the first electrical power in Saugatuck. And it ran year-round. Of course, in the summer it was much busier because of the pavilion and bringing all the tourists into town. And it continued into service until 1926. All that remains now in town is a portion of track bed with no track on it, that if you go back to the Peterson Nature Preserve and you look north, there's a trail there. Mm-hmm. That is the track bed for the interurban. Oh. And it was the later version of the interurban, because when they got the bigger railroad car, there was a big trestle across the gully. And the map over at the museum in Douglas has the track across the trestle, and then it comes down North Street, or down Holland Street. Well, when they switched to the bigger gauge railroad, they couldn't go on the trestle because the cars were too heavy. So they had to regrade for down the hill. And if you go on that street, you can look over, especially this time of year, and you can see the track bed up in the woods. They came down the hill and across the North Street and down at the base of the gully, all the way through to Mill Street, I think it is back there, or Simonson Drive. And then it turns to the right and goes toward Lucy Street. So the train would go down and come down Lucy Street and turn and go down Water Street. So that was the last track for the interurban. And now our public bus system is nostalgically called the interurban. And that's where that name came from. This is an interurban waiting station that was brought in from, I think, north of town. It survived for many years, and it's now in the park. And it's our little information booth, but it is a historic building. And behind we're down back at the Village Hall, and I wanted to show you this marker on Water Street. The property for the City Hall was a cemetery. And when they were building the City Hall, they found human remains. And some of them were Native American remains. One group of remains was put there because there was a ship that went down off of Saugatuck. It was called the Milwaukee in 1843. And it came from St. Joe Benton Harbor, I think. And it stopped to Saugatuck to get a load of flour because of the grist mill at the Butler would make flour. And they loaded up and they started out, and the weather was okay, and then when they got out, the weather got really bad. So the crew was lost, and because the ship foundered and broke up. 11 crew members were found and were buried here in that cemetery. But because of the flour barrels that were there that washed up on the shore in 1843, that really actually helped the community because it was a very cold winter, and the flour barrels provided extra food for the folks living in the flats at that time. But this marker is for the Native American remains that they found, and those were given to the Grand Rapids Public Museum at the time, but they may have been reinstated with the tribe. There were 3 major tribes in the Michigan Territory: the Ojibwe, or the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. The Potawatomi were in the Saugatuck area, and they were skilled canoe makers out of Birch Bark. And of course, if you've seen the exhibits over at the History Center, they make gorgeous baskets and other beautiful, beautiful crafts. But this was the way they lived, and they made all that stuff to live with, not as art objects. But we were fortunate to have many Native Americans. Another area that was something I need to tell you about at Peterson's Mill, when Rollie Peterson dug up the pond in front of the mill to make his reflection pond, they found a whole bunch of artifacts, one of which was a mortar and pestle, a big mortar and pestle, and other things. So that area was a campsite for Native Americans, as well as being in Mount Bald and all that kind of stuff. So, all right, Hotel Butler, built in 1892. It was a steam-powered grist mill. Remember the flour on the ship? And then it was sold and remodeled in 1901, and it opened up as a summer resort. In 1961, Pat and Verse White, some of you may remember them, bought the hotel and ran it as a hotel and a restaurant until 1971. Then they removed the 2 top floors and reopened it as the Butler Restaurant. In 2021, they sold it to the Redwater Restaurants. And now the Redwater Restaurants built their outdoor thing. And then we have in the front yard of the Village Hall, we have our historical marker for the Singapore town. And it's now known as a ghost town. Most of the buildings were taken down, torn down, or brought into town. There's not, it's not buried under the sand so much anymore. But anyway, it was, the land was purchased in 1836, and in 1848, James Fenimore Cooper's was, his setting for Oak Openings is this surrounding area for the book that James Fenimore Cooper wrote. So Singapore was bustling, and Saugatuck has been bustling ever since. I think that's it.
All right.